Hey Young Turks, I'm Nomi Konst, here in New York City, where I rarely broadcast from because we're usually on the road working on all these different stories, but it's such a beautiful day in New York that I thought, why not do an update on New York politics and what it means for the national political landscape. From Tompkins Square Park in the East Village of New York, Tompkins Square Park has always been a hub for activism. It was the scene of the famous Tompkins Square Park riots. There have always been thinkers and illustrators and artists and activism in this area for decades. So why not talk a little bit about the state of New York politics and what it means for the nation on the day that the session in the Albany was supposed to end. Okay, so you guys have all been following my IDC stories. That is the Independent Democratic Conference. That is a group of 8 rogue Democrats elected in Democratic districts who decided that they were going to go form their own conference, split off from the Democratic Senate, and as a result, work out these deals with the Republican Senate. And these deals are essentially perks. They are able to send more pork back to their district, more money back to their district. They get more stipends, money that they can spend on a daily basis. In New York, we call them Lulus. Those are all being investigated now because ultimately what that did was it prevented the New York State Senate from becoming Democratic, even though it was elected to be that. But the big story is the New York State in general could have a governor that's a Democrat, a Senate that's Democratic, and the Assembly that's Democratic, but it is not. It could be one of 7 completely controlled Democratic states. Now, for those who have been following the story, you know very well that Governor Cuomo has had a partnership with Jeff Klein, the founder of the IDC, for several years. Governor Cuomo went out there and campaigned just a couple years ago against teachers unions and pro-charter schools with Jeff Klein, with Flanagan, who is the head of the New York State Senate, is a Republican. He went out there and he campaigned with them against teachers unions. Now, I want to focus on teachers unions because I think this is ultimately what this all comes down to. Governor Cuomo, earlier this year in January when he was giving the State of the State, he wanted to champion all these issues. Free college. We know that he gave a watered-down version of free college that really only benefits the upper middle class. He talked about ethics reform. He talked about voting reform. New York State is the most closed primary state in the country. You all are all familiar with that. 117,000 ballots were purged in Brooklyn and are now being investigated by the Justice Department, which was all brought on by Eric Schneiderman, the New York State Attorney General. You know, these were things that Governor Cuomo said in his State of the State that he would champion, but he's done nothing. He's done nothing about ethics reform. He's done nothing about voter reform. He has not even addressed them in an op-ed. He hasn't tweeted about them. He hasn't gone on TV. He gave the State of the State, which he knew would get possibly national attention, championing very popular agenda items, and hasn't even put them forward. Now, the Senate, the Democrats in the Senate, which should be controlling the Senate, put forth legislation for voting reform and ethics reform, which is actually pretty unpopular because if you're going to talk about ethics reform, a lot of lawmakers would be affected by that. But it is such a dire situation, it's such a dire issue in New York State. We've had so many lawmakers go to jail, including the Speaker of the Assembly, who was there for 25 years plus just recently, and the Senate. You have the people around Governor Cuomo who are being investigated and indicted. So why does this all matter? All right, New York State, clearly there's a lot of corruption in New York. Clearly Governor Cuomo puts things out there that he thinks are going to be popular and doesn't actually follow through on them, or if he does, it's a very watered down version of them. Clearly he's working with the IDC so that he doesn't have to veto a bunch of progressive legislation. But why does he care so much? He is on the top of the list right now for presidential candidates in 2020. You know, it's very hard historically for somebody who's a sitting governor to run for president as their sitting governor because you have to govern a state, you have to work with the legislatures, and if they're not all on your side, then it's very hard to deal with them. But he also has to raise money for a presidential campaign. He has recently hired over a dozen communications specialists to come into his mansion in Albany to work with him on messaging on the state's dime, to send out videos of the successes that he's had. It's essentially a PR campaign while he's in the governor's mansion. he's doing all these things on the dime of the governor. He's also raising money for the Democratic Party, but not spending it on the Democratic Party. He's spending it on his agenda, but he isn't going out there and campaigning for the Senate. He's not going out there and campaigning for the Assembly. He's really just using that money. I mean, this has all been reported on extensively, and we've talked about this. This is a roundup. But why would the governor not want to pass ethics reform? Why would the governor not want to pass any sort of voting reform? Could that affect the way could affect his goals in the future? If he indeed does want to run for president, right now there are these things called the LLC loopholes. Now, what is the LLC loophole? It sounds really wonky, right? Well, in New York, right now, if you have an LLC, you can essentially donate the max, and you can have multiple LLCs versus, a human being can only donate as much as that human being can donate, right? Well, real estate companies have a lot of control and a lot of money in this state, and they want to make sure that they can develop as much as possible. So they use their LLCs for each of their real estate investments. It could be an apartment complex, it could be 3 apartments. But if you have multiple complexes and multiple apartments, that means each one of those can donate to an individual. And so that's how, one of the reasons why the IDC and Governor Cuomo and the Republicans have been able, and Democrats to be fair, have been able to raise a lot of money. But more importantly, if you look at where this money is coming from, and this is the big story, I'm sorry to bury the lead, it's charter schools. Governor Cuomo has been going through this debate, this fight with Mayor de Blasio over mayoral control over the school systems in New York. It's a local issue, but it actually has a lot of national impact. When I started to look at the list of Democrats, all these reporters are like, who are the Democrats who are gonna run for president in 2020? Who's on the bench? And I looked at them as Cory Booker. You've got Governor Cuomo, Kamala Harris. A lot of these folks have some things in common, and that is their ties to Wall Street, and essentially their ties to charter schools. Charter schools have pumped a lot of money into the Democratic Party, and I think the dividing lines in the Democratic Party really come down to charter schools and teachers unions. Teachers unions in history have given more money to the Democratic Party than any other institution, and of course charter schools want to essentially make money off of education when the word is out now. It's not 5, 6, 7 years ago. There have been studies about this. Charter schools don't perform better than public schools, and in a lot of cases they self-select who's going to go to these schools. But in particular, they are setting the standards for their own test cases, smaller class sizes, and they're still not doing better than public schools, which aren't able to kind of like create their own chessboard of what they want to do with schools. So charter schools are pumping a ton of money into New York State. They're funding the IDC, they're funding Governor Cuomo, and they're funding the Republicans. And Governor Cuomo, if you run for president, you got to raise a lot of money. You got to raise, arguably $1 billion, but who knows, because that may all change in the next couple of years. So Governor Cuomo has been really taking a lot of that money over the past few years, and he campaigns on other progressive issues. So I think after this session, when you start to look at the divides in the Democratic Party, you see that ethics reform isn't being passed because it would affect Governor Cuomo. Governor Cuomo shut down this thing called the Moreland Commission. He campaigned in 2010 on reforming the Democratic Party, on an anti-corruption platform, and then he created this thing called the Moreland Commission. The Moreland Commission was there to investigate public corruption in New York State. Except as soon as that Moreland Commission started to look into his office, he shut it down. And that's when Preet Bharara, who we now know is out of office, or out of his seat because of Trump, he started to look into why the Moreland Commission was shut down. So ethics reform would affect how Governor Cuomo conducts his business. And a lot of that affects how he could run for re-election as governor or possibly president. Voting reform, for New York State, a very progressive state, and I'm from upstate New York, I'm from Western New York, from Buffalo. People say, okay, well, New York's not that progressive, you're just looking at downstate. That's true, but the numbers are in downstate. And when you poll people within the state, everybody wants ethics reform. Everybody wants voting reform. When you poll people nationally, 75% of Democrats want voting reform. They're in favor of, and this is going to get me a lot of pushback because I've seen it online, they're in favor of open primaries. Now, are open primaries perfect? No. There's so many different types of primaries between closed primaries and open primaries. There's same-day registration. There's all these different reforms you can do. But New York State makes it so difficult for people to vote that public interest groups like Citizens Union has gone out there and said it is a form of voter suppression, and it is. In the presidential primary, you had to register well before the debates existed. There's no same-day registration. If you move, in particular, this affects young people, people of color, people who've been economically disparaged as effect of the economy, who have to move a lot. I mean, New York is an incredibly unaffordable city to live in, and personally, I know a lot of people are moving constantly, and it's very hard to be able to vote in a primary, let alone a general election. So voting reform is incredibly popular in the state. It's a very transient city, New York City. A lot of the other cities are still transient. There's a generational divide. Young people are blocked from voting because they are bearing the consequences of the economy. So this is something that's so popular, but Governor Cuomo has done nothing on it. And if we had these 8 Democrats who were elected as Democrats voting with the Democratic Party in the Senate, if the Senate was actually Democratic and in control, we would have voting reform passed. The LLC loophole would be closed out. You'd have ethics reform passed. Not to mention, there's a single payer. There's a proposal for single payer on the agenda right now. Essentially, the story here is you've got charter schools funding these 8 Democrats and Governor Cuomo because they want their interests to be put forward. They don't want public schools to have more funding. They want to have their funding, which is ultimately about Wall Street and hedge funds. But in the meantime, they're taking down all this other progressive legislation. In an era of Trump, at a time when Donald Trump and his budget are cutting education funding, they're cutting reproductive rights funding, they're cutting access to Planned Parenthood, they're cutting EPA funding, you go through the list of things, and those things are all being cut. But charter schools are not just trying to protect their interests. They are taking down all this other progressive legislation in the meantime, because if New York State is not one of the leaders in these policies right now, including single payer, which is incredibly popular at a time when the Health Care Act is at risk. We have Obamacare at risk of being defunded and completely being cut out by Republicans. When all of those things are at risk of being lost, New York State could stand up and say, you know what? We're going to protect our people because we are one of 7 democratically controlled states. We're the Excelsior state. It's not just that we're New York and we're one of 7 democratically controlled states. We are New York. We are the state of Trump. We are the state where progress has always started. We move forward. We are a state where we have between the Bronx and Queens, we have the most diverse areas in the world. So we should be championing these issues. Instead, we have the most closed primary system. We have 8 Democrats who are caucusing, who are working with Republicans right now, and Governor Cuomo is allowing that to happen because he's orchestrating it. This man wants to run for president. This man wants to be the champion of the Democratic Party, yet he is literally cutting deals behind closed doors with Republicans on his terms because he wants to be able to control the chessboard. So I ask you, TYT, are you going to allow this to happen? Because this isn't just about New York anymore, this is about the country. We have the opportunity to protect key pieces of legislation, to set the standard across the country. And it's not just that the Democratic Party in New York is incapable of doing so, and that New York State isn't capable of creating voter reform and ethics reform and single payer and education reform, all these issues. It's that we are last on the list for some of these issues. When New York has the most closed voting system in the country, who does that protect? Incumbents. So now it comes down to you guys. What are you going to do about it? There's so much information out there. We can talk through all the different types of legislation that have been blocked because the Senate in New York State is not democratically controlled when it should be. But really, it comes down to Governor Cuomo. Governor Cuomo, if you want to be the president of the United States, if you're going to use if you're going to use your mansion in Albany, the governor's mansion, to go out there and put out your plans and use former presidential media strategists to put out videos, you must think that that voters are not smart anymore. They're educated, they're informed, they want real progressives, they're going to follow the money because that's most importantly what people are paying attention to is they're following the money. And all the money comes back to the hedge fund controlled charter schools. And I urge all of you to look into every single Democrat that you see on these lists and see if they're accepting money from charter schools. Because they might walk a good walk and talk a good talk, but that's how these charter schools go out there and recruit candidates. They want the next shiny bright object as long as they're in support of charter schools. But we're the FDR party, and we got to start looking that way. So I urge you guys to be informed, engaged, continue all of your actions. There's been a lot of great groups out here in New York who have been informing New Yorkers and beyond about what's happening with the IDC. This is unjust. This is completely unique to New York politics, but New York is obviously a very important state. So that's my quick New York update. Not so quick New York update. It's a beautiful day in Tompkins Square Park in the East Village. And yeah. I will see you later. I'm Nomi Kans. This is TYT Politics.